Okay, we're at 5:30 now. I'd like to call the meeting to order, please. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this planning committee of Monday, the 29th of July. I'm moving straight on with the agenda, and the agenda item 1 is apologies, to receive apologies for absence. Who do we have, please?
We have apologies from councillors Atkinson, Bennett and Ralston, Chair.
Atkinson, Bennett and Ralston, thank you very much indeed. Now moving on to item number 2, which is the minutes of the last meeting. The last meeting was held on the 29th of May. Was on 70 Admiral Way and other matters. I'm looking for councillors who were present at that meeting to come up with any comments, criticisms or otherwise. I have nothing. Okay. Therefore seek your permission to sign those into the record. Can I have a show of hands, please, for accepting? Thank you. I will sign those later. We come to item 3. This is declarations of interest. I will remind all councillors present on this committee that you must declare any disclosable pecuniary interests that relate to the business and agenda which have not already been included in the register of interest. You must do so before any discussion takes place on that item. Do any councillors wish to intimate they have interests in any other business? No, I see nobody. Right, we can move on to 4. Okay, exclusion of the press and public. This is a public meeting and I would hope that it could remain so. So I see no reason at all to bring forward the exclusion clause. And so we'll move on to Councillor Mitchell.
I just raise a legal question for the solicitor to answer before we even discuss item 5. Item 5 has material implication of item 5 has already been discussed by the council, discussed by the executive, and a result decision made. None of us here on this side of the table were voting that decision, so we're quite free to make our decision. One member of the committee is a member of the executive and voted on that matter at that time. I'm concerned that if this ever became subject to an appeal, depending on the decision or the outcome of this debate, that could be grounds used at the appeal. And I'd just like some clarification.
I can't hear a thing, sorry.
Would you like me to repeat it? All right. At the executive meeting, a decision was made in regard to a material consideration in regard to this application. Right? That was a resolved matter which could not be altered. That went through full council. Every member except one of this committee is not a member of the executive, so therefore we're not involved in that decision. So therefore we are free, I believe, to consider this application having been involved in no previous discussion. My question to the solicitor was whether the member of the executive who is a member of this committee is in an awkward position effectively in regard to discussing this application. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. The decision that was made at executive related to a sale of land. We are considering at the planning committee decision to essentially grant planning permission or
Sorry,
not.
we can't hear a thing.
Sorry. So the question at executive was about whether or not to sell a piece of land. And the question that we are considering this evening is to determine the planning application. So the two matters are distinct. And so members are reminded to keep an open mind as they would with respect to any planning application. And members who feel that they are precluded because they may have predetermined any application should in the usual way withdraw. But otherwise, I can see no reason for members who participate in that vote to not be able to participate this evening.
Are you satisfied with that, Councillor Mitchell?
Well, the only other issue in this outline permission is in regard and includes access as well. And the piece of land in question is in regard to access. That was what the reason I raised the question.
Yes. Sorry, that's correct, councillor, but again, relating to planning issues rather than land issues. So we're considering it from a planning aspect.
Okay, with that in mind, we are moving on to item number 5, which is planning application 25/0511/OUT, which is the land off Pendragon Road. I'll now pass on to the officer to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is an outline planning application for a residential development of up to 100 dwellings and associated infrastructure. All matters are reserved apart from access. The application site itself is the lower 2/3 of a 5.18 hectare set of fields located to the north of Pendragon Road. It's bordered by mature hedge banks with a central hedge bank dividing the two fields. So the site itself is the lower 2/3 of these. That top third, outlined in blue, is proposed to become public open space with a new hedgerow installed between the two areas. This illustrative layout shows a possible layout for the site, but it should be noted that only access is proposed to be agreed at this stage. I will move on to that in a second. The access itself is proposed from the southern boundary only, and it goes onto Pendragon Road across an existing hedge bank and a grass verge that is currently owned by the council. Any sale of this land would fall outside of the remit of this planning application. This application's had 196 comments received, with 132 objections and 62 supporting. The objections raise many issues, including the loss of the open space, ecological harm, impacts on the landscape, highway concerns, and lack of facilities. The supporting comments included the land gaining a use, the 50% affordable housing, more homes for people, the lack of brownfield sites in the area, and a history of residential developments in the surrounding area. So in terms of the setting for the site, it's important to note that it's within the Northern Hills landscape setting area, and it's also adjacent to county wildlife sites, which is Mincing Lake and Savoy Hill, and it's also next to the two valley parks. So this application follows application 21/0020. That application was refused at planning committee originally, but allowed at appeal. So it was refused at planning committee for harm to the character and local distinctiveness of the landscape setting, the loss of open space, harm to a site of nature conservation along the southern boundary, and access roads failing to integrate with the southern boundary. The appeal went to hearing, and the inspector allowed the appeal in August last year. In relation to that appeal, the following matters are of importance. The southern boundary along the site is been confirmed as no longer being within a site of nature conservation, and that suitable mitigation was able to be provided through the introduction of a new hedge bank at the north of the site between it and the public space. The inspector considered that the loss of the open space would be mitigated by the provision of the public open space to the north of the site, and that there would be limited harm to the landscape setting, and that the benefits of the scheme outweighed the harm. I'll go into more detail about that particular aspect shortly. During the appeal process, a revised planning application was submitted. This saw the red line of the site boundary reduced to remove the top area from within it, although it's still within the blue line. As this was a variation to the refused scheme and the appeal hadn't been issued yet, it was accepted as a new application. The appeal decision was issued before a decision was made on this one, and that's why it's here in front of you today. The applicant was asked if they wished to withdraw the second application, and they declined to do so. It was also examined whether we could refuse to determine the application, but as the proposal had changed from that originally refused through the alteration of the red line, it was concluded that that was not possible. So in terms of the scheme itself, the inspector's decision The inspector's decision to allow the appeal does set a precedent of acceptability for certain aspects of the scheme. So the main considerations are therefore what the changes are from that appeal. The red line change itself isn't considered to make any significant change to the appeal decision, as the area to the north of the site was proposed to be secured as public open space in that appeal, and it's still proposed to be secured as public open space through legal agreement through this application. Therefore, the main issue itself would be in relation to the council's housing land supply and the tilted balance and the overall planning balance of the proposal. The previous application was assessed and allowed under the tilted balance in favour of sustainable development. So at that point, the council could not demonstrate a 5-year housing supply, which meant that the development should be approved unless the adverse impacts would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. Since that appeal decision date, a new national planning policy framework has been published, which has altered the housing supply requirements. Because the council's at a Regulation 18 stage of the new Exeter plan, it's now subject to a 4-year housing supply, and it can currently demonstrate a supply of 5 years and 1 month, so in excess of what is required. This means that the tilted balance is no longer in effect, and we can give full balance to all the considerations of this scheme. So as set out in the officer report, the landscape setting is the primary material consideration of this scheme, and whether the harm will outweigh the overall benefits. The inspector's decision advised, as I said, that there was limited harm. Their report goes into more detail, and the officer report goes into a lot more detail of it, but there are a couple of choice paragraphs that I think are important to note. The first being that the proposed development of the appeal site would alter the character through the introduction of built form and associated infrastructure and lighting. This would likely involve relatively extensive engineering to respond to the slopes within the site. The site would lose most of its rurality and tranquility. Even the proposed areas of open space would be more landscaped and would be experienced in the context of the proposed housing that would border these spaces. It would result in a loss of some of the substantial hedgerow and trees to the southern boundary, and would therefore afford views into the site that do not exist or are heavily screened at present. However, the inspector stated that the site would be well screened by the surrounding hedgerow, and that whilst it would be more visible in winter, it would be seen in the context of the existing northern extent of the city. The rural and tranquil setting would still remain. It would just be pushed further back to the public open space to the north and the ridgeline above that. They noted that the middle and long distance views of the site would see the tranquil and rural setting remain, and that the harm would be limited. And I'll quote their conclusion in relation to this aspect, which is that nevertheless, the proposal consequently fails to comply with policy CP16 of the core strategy, which protects the landscape of the hills to the north of the city and the valley parks. It fails to comply with policy LS1 of the local plan first review, which requires the proposals do not harm the landscape setting of the city and be integrated into the existing landscape. It fails to comply with policy DG1 of the local plan, which requires proposals to be fully integrated into the existing landscape of the city, promote local distinctiveness and contribute positively to the soundscape. And it also fails to comply with Chapter 12, in particular, paragraph 130C of the National Planning Policy Framework, which requires high quality design that is sympathetic to local character and landscape setting. And lastly, it fails to comply with paragraph 174A and B of the framework, which recognises the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside and protects valued landscapes. Whilst the inspector gave this matter moderate weight, they concluded that the harm itself was limited to more local views, and that the adverse effects of the proposal are limited and relate only to the character and appearance. And even there, the harm would fall largely on the site itself and not to the wider tranquility and rural nature of the fields to the north. The tilted balance in favour of sustainable development was in effect at this point, and the inspector placed substantial weight on the provision of housing and the provision of affordable housing. They did not consider that there was harm that significantly or demonstrably outweighed the benefits by allowing the appeal. So they've got some photos of the site here. So this shows the treed hedge bank along Pendragon Road. And we've got some of the wider panoramic views from the top of the fields. And this is a view from the Chartered Landscape report for the appeal scheme, where you can see the site there with the arrow. And we have some more photos here of the proposed open space, and this is from the Spruce Close site to the northeast of the application. So in assessing the scheme itself, the central element is therefore whether the moderate harm identified by the inspector in relation to the landscape setting outweighs the benefits of the scheme, which include 50% affordable housing, the creation of the public open space to the north of the site, and the associated Section 106 obligations set out in the report and the additional information sheet. The landscape setting harm itself, identified by the inspector, was considered to be limited to local impact, and the medium and long distance views of the rural setting of the hills have been retained, although pushed further back. In light of this position by the inspector, it is considered that the benefits continue to outweigh the harm caused, and it is on balance put to the committee with a recommendation for approval in line with the information on the additional information sheet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now invite questions from members to the officer on his presentation. Councillor Ketchin.
Thanks, Chris, for your presentation. Can you explain the use of the word sustainable when describing that site? Is it sustainable or not sustainable? I was of the impression sustainability talked to things like active travel, access to cycling, city centre locations, density, those sort of elements.
So sustainable development is defined in the National Planning Policy Framework, and there's three parts to it. It's an economic aspect, a social aspect, and I've got an absolute mind blank on the other one. Environmental, thank you. So in relation to that, those are the three aspects that we consider when defining sustainable development. With this scheme, those aspects have been assessed through the previous scheme, through the appeal itself, and it would be considered a form of sustainable development. So, and in terms of sort of public active travel and things like that with the site, it is on a bus route that actually travels across the bottom of where the proposed access is into the site.
Councillor Ketchin, okay. Councillor Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. May we just have an understanding of the relationship between this application and the application that was refused at committee and then went to appeal, in terms of if this committee were to refuse this application, what would happen to the original application? Is that is still valid and available to be developed on? Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. The allowed appeal would still stand. This application wouldn't change anything about that. Yeah. The only thing that would be altered if this application got approved is the time limit for submission of reserved matters and for them to commence on site. It would essentially give them sort of almost an extra year to start the planning permission compared to that of the appeal site or scheme.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Thank you, Councillor Paul.
Thank you. Two questions, if I may. The first is there a breakdown of what affordable means in the context of this application? It says 50%, but does that mean affordable, which is 80% of market rent, or does it mean social or a mix of the two? And the second question is I know it's only a graphic on page 12 of the presentation, which is the appeal scheme in juxtaposed with the application scheme. That's the one that, yeah. What I can't see though is the bit that's going to be public open space is how you get to it. The path seems to stop at the hedge. I know it's only a graphic and there may be a very simple answer. Thank you.
Thank you. In relation to the affordable housing, it would be in line with our standard affordable housing provision. I haven't got a copy of the Section 106 agreement in front of me at the moment. I'm not sure if Simon's able to just, I think it's 70-30 split on it. But Simon will just double check on that. In terms of the access to the open space, the layout hasn't been confirmed at this stage. That would be a matter for the reserved matters application. There are buffer zones put in that are required by condition by the hedgerow. So in terms of the development that can occur there, it may be no dig, it will come down to the reserved matters details essentially.
Are we able to comment on the level of affordability yet?
Yes. So it's the 50% affordable housing mix is at least 25% first homes, 70% social rented, and the remaining balance on intermediate housing.
Councillor Pole next.
Yeah, I'm just a bit concerned about in the presentation and the documentation about the landscape and visual impact. From reading the reports and looking at the interpretation in the presentation of the planning inspector's comments, it seemed that there's a lot of confusion about the landscape and visual impact report that the developer commissioned and whether or not it was fit for purpose, and the findings of our independent experts that reviewed that, and some of the wording was a little bit confusing about whether or not it was the original developers landscape and visual impact report that should be disregarded, or whether it should be the landscape and visual impact should be disregarded in considering the scheme. And yeah, so I just think that there's been a lot of confusion in the genesis of the documentation and the position on the tilted balance on the landscape and visual. And yeah, I'm just kind of wondering whether all of that has been taken into consideration in this sort of final presentation. That seems to sort of indicate that the impact has been found to be not so important, but that does appear to be important both by looking at the pictures and also from reading the experts' position on the original landscape and visual impact report that was submitted.
It's understandable. It is quite a unique situation with this one in terms of how we're dealing with the appeal process. So the landscape visual impact assessment, I'll call it the LVIA I'll keep garbling my words otherwise. The LVIAs that have been used are the ones that were used in the appeal scheme and were discussed at the appeal. The council's appointed chartered landscape expert assessed the submitted LVIA by the applicant, disagreed with large parts of it, and this was all then presented to the inspector. The inspector didn't disregard the applicant's LVIA assessment, and it was all discussed and assessed by the inspector on it. So the inspector's interpretation of that, and their following the hearing and their site visits, was that it was moderate harm being created, limited harm, and giving it moderate weight to the landscape setting. That is their opinion of it, and that was balanced with the tilted balance in favour of sustainable development. So the committee may choose to take a different view, but it would have to be fully justified on why there would be a disagreement with the inspector's view of the site and their decision on it. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, so effectively we have an expert landscape chartered surveyor who's taking a position that the report that said that the landscape impact was negligible, they found that report was not fit for purpose because it hadn't taken some of the longer views into consideration. And against that, we have the tilted balance position of the inspector. Is that my understanding?
The inspector would have taken both reports into account when assessing the site. So they would have looked at our chartered architect's comments and the submitted LVIA from the applicant. They would then have done their own assessment of all the views, and if anything was missing, they should have identified it and brought it to our attention with it. I know that I was part of the hearing for the previous scheme, and there were long distance views that we were taking to on recommendation from local residents. So the inspector had full consideration of all of the views, regardless of what was in the submitted LVIAs.
Thank you. Just a pause for a moment, please, before I move on to Councillor Mitchell. The director would like to make a comment.
Yeah, I could just help with the clarification, Councillor Pole. I think that your question was about whether the two different landscape visual assessments were considered. They were both considered by the inspectors. They came to a view based on those reports that there was a moderate impact. The question about the tilted balance is a completely separate matter.
Okay.
So they made an assessment of the landscape impact, in addition to which the tilted balance was also in play, but they are entirely separate matters. So the view that they came to was based on both reports, and they came to a view about the impact. But then there was the tilted balance was after that, if you like. Does that make sense?
But effectively, there are two different landscape visual impact expert reports out there.
Yes.
One of which is more favourable, and one of which is less favourable to that position.
Indeed.
And
and the inspectors looked at both.
Yeah.
And came to a view.
Okay.
And the view was that it was moderate harm.
Thank you.
Councillor Mitchell.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just ask for some advice on the weight we should attribute to the existing appeal report on the site? Because it is extremely detailed, 18 pages of it, and it does follow a logical pattern of argument. You can see the argument the inspectors were using, etc. And you've already pointed out the tilted balance point, which has now changed since that time. But as a member, it's unusual to have a scheme come back for the same site from the same developer on one where they've already run an appeal. So I'm just wondering what degree of certainty we should give when making our determination to the existing appeal report. That's the first question. The second question is in relation to paragraph 32 of the appeal document. If I could just read the last sentence, which I'd like some comment on. I place significant weight on the policy compliant of affordable housing, i.e. 35%, and very substantial weight on proposed affordable housing above that level, i.e. 15%, making the 50%. And clearly, that makes the scheme from a local authority's perspective look extremely attractive in relation to the housing needs we have in the community. What assurance have we got? Because there's been no viability studies that we're ever anywhere near 35%, let alone 50%, which is another concern, which is that do developers use this as a ploy and then claw back at a later stage when permissions are granted?
In relation to your second question about the weight to be given to affordable housing, members are determining the application as proposed this evening, which is with 50% affordable housing. If that was to change, it would come back to this committee for a fresh decision. But the application before you is with 50% affordable housing. And the weight to be given is one for your judgment, although you should take into account the inspector's decision, which is a significant material consideration for you. The same goes for the level of landscape harm. So I would hope that members have read the report with the extracts taken from the appeal decision in regard to the appeal inspector's opinion on the level of landscape harm and the comments made. The inspector concluded that the harm would be limited and gave that moderate weight. Ultimately, you as members need to come to your own decision and justify it this evening.
Just follow clarification on the point on affordable housing and the 35%. In the past, there tends to be a viability study which deals with finances, etc. We come back with a new figure. What I'm trying to get from you, Matt, if it's clarity, if they do not deliver the 50% and come back with a lower figure, does that invalidate the application?
If I can help, Councillor Mitchell. So we only require viability appraisals if an applicant is proposing a sub-policy level of affordable housing. So they come in with a above level, so that there is no need and no requirement to undertake a viability appraisal. As the officers said, if subsequently the applicant is proposing a lesser level, even if it's above policy compliant but less than 50, we would still bring that back here for your consideration.
That is only in relation to the amount of housing that we allow of that type. It doesn't in any way invalidate the approval of the application, does it not?
So the application that you're considering this evening is a different planning application, albeit more or less the same. The application that went to appeal, that's been approved, and that can be implemented.
I'm still unclear that if the developers offering us 50%, well, yippee, that's the thing that sells it, we'll go for the 50%. Later on comes back the viability estimate to say, sorry, I can only deliver 28, 30% or whatever. What I'm trying to gather from you, that at that stage, even though he or she has come back with a lower number than was in the original application, the planning application is still valid, that they don't have to go through a process again. In other words, it's just a negotiation on numbers, not a negotiation on the validity of the application.
So the approval, the appeal decision has with it a Section 106 agreement that requires that level of affordable housing, and that would be the same if this committee were minded to grant permission. It would carry with it that 106 agreement. If between this committee's decision and the signing of that 106 agreement, the applicant came back and asked for a lower amount, we would bring that application back for your consideration, along with a viability assessment, no doubt. So basically, there's a requirement now on the planning permission that's granted an appeal for a level of affordable housing that they would have to satisfy under that permission.
You can't hear a thing, sorry. You need to really shout.
Can I just say at this point, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to go home. I haven't heard one word in 6. I haven't a clue what anybody's talking about. This has been a complete waste of my time.
I'm sorry, but obviously the mechanics of our microphones is not functioning for such a large audience. I will remind you that this committee is available live streamed on YouTube, and you can watch it possibly with earphones in at the same time as being here, in order to be able to get perhaps a better hearing of what's going on. I can't, however, have any more interruptions of our committee process because we have a lot of items to discuss and we do want to give this matter every consideration. So I would like, please, for us to continue. I have Councillor Hughes.
Please speak a little bit louder, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I'll use my best teacher voice for the audience at the back, so hopefully you can hear me. My question relates to the public open space. And bear with me as I give you the context of why I'm asking this question. Who will maintain the public open space? Having lived on Lancelot Road in a previous life, I'm very aware of the issues with fly tipping on any green space in that part of Mincing Lake and Whipton Ward. So I'm just wondering, how can we guarantee that that public open space that we're being sold as a, hey, here's a really great thing for you, how are we going to ensure that it will actually be usable by the public rather than it being somewhere for fly tipping and a quiet space for drug use? So yeah, in particular, I'm talking about historically the area between Lancelot Road and Savoy Hill. Beautiful wooded area, usually filled with somebody's old tumble dryer and a few mattresses that the children like to set fire to occasionally. So that's the context for my question. Thank you.
So the maintenance of it would be secured through the Section 106 agreement. Normally there is an option for it to be offered to the council that the council may or may not choose to take. If it does, then maintenance would be dealt with by the council. If it stays under separate ownership, there would be a requirement for details of maintenance of it and a responsible company to take over it. So that if there were any issues with fly tipping or anything like that, there is a point of contact to get things resolved, as well as to keep on top of maintenance of it or trimming of anything.
Thank you. As we get back to councillors having second bites, the chair, including yourself, Councillor Ketchin, can I remind you to stick to questions for officers, please? Is that what's going to happen, rather than moving into debate? We'll have the debate later. Got more questions? Yeah.
Page 45, electrical vehicle charging and cycle parking. This is, if this goes ahead, it's going to be a couple of years before it's all done and dusted. In 2030, the government's requirements being brought forward again under the new government that all vehicles will have an electric component to them. This is a hilly site. The electric cycles are also going to be more compelling on the site. I noticed that the charging requirements are only 1 in 10 dwellings with off-street parking need to put in a charger. Is that just standard council policy currently? Is there a policy on cycle charging abutting the cycle storage? And should it be reconsidered that 1 in 10 spaces which have off-street parking only have a charger? It's putting an undue burden on future residents. That's page 45, item 8 and 9.
In relation to the electric vehicle charging, this is based on our SPD guidelines. There is also a building regulations requirement for specific levels of EV charging for vehicles. And if that is updated again by the government, then that would supersede any requirement here. So there is the potential that as we get closer to 2030, and if that's still a requirement, the building regulations would be updated accordingly in line with it. In relation to electric bicycle charging, there's not currently any guidance or requirements set out in our policies for those to be supplied at this time.
Thank you. Councillor Pole.
Sorry. Okay, I had a question. There was mention of a buffer zone between the site and the county wildlife site, and I'm not really, that doesn't seem to be specified. There's some talk about buffers with hedgerows, but the buffer for the county wildlife site, I'm not. This came out of a Devon Wildlife Trust objection, and I don't see it really dealt with in the in what we've got in front of us today. Also, right, my understanding is that in terms of what would be agreeing on, it's to delegate the permission to grant, but that all of the S106 would have to be delivered. There wouldn't be anything. Everything would have to be delivered as set out. Otherwise, it would come back here, not just the affordable housing. That's I think my understanding, but just want to make sure of that. And I think the other thing was sorry, can I just leave it for those two for now?
Thank you, Councillor. In relation to the buffer zones, the condition 15 requires a buffer zone for the hedge banks. The council's ecologist didn't request any additional buffer zones for the county wildlife sites. They seem to be satisfied that the buffer zones around the hedgerow surrounding the site and the new northern hedgerow would be suitable to help serve the county wildlife sites as well. With regards to the Section 106 agreement, as set out in the additional information sheet, the recommendation is for all of that's set out in that on the second page of it. So it would be all of the Section 106 agreements and all of the conditions. That would be what you're voting on or deciding on today.
So, and my other question was about, so again, going back to the inspector's comments about the landscape setting and the visual impact. I think there were some comments in there about needing to do quite extensive work on changing the level of the fields and the slant of the fields. So again, is that something that you could comment on, and will that, if that adds significantly to the developer's costs, like where does that leave the planning application if it's granted and those requirements are, is that a reserved matter? I think, is that really my question?
So the inspector noted that the site would likely involve relatively extensive engineering to respond to the slopes. However, the exact layout and design of the site itself is a reserved matter. So we don't know what the actual, this is just an illustrative layout. It could change completely from that, apart from the aspects that we are securing, or we would secure through the conditions which are, and this application, which are the access points and everything within the conditions, such as the buffer zones and those details.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Jobson.
Thank you. This is a follow-up to Councillor Mitchell's question on the what happens if the developer wants to reduce the number of affordable houses. It's obvious that on this application, there's no inspector involved. Were it to be granted and the developer then wanted to change his mind, it would come back to this committee. What happens about the appeal scheme? The developer has made some strong points. If we refuse tonight's application, the appeal decision stands. What happens then to the Section 106? Can that still come back to this council? If we then determined that we would refuse the ability to reduce the number of affordable homes. So we rejected, and I think we have grounds to do that on the basis the inspector's been quite forceful about it. That would in effect then overturn the decision if the developer felt they could not go ahead. I hope I've phrased that okay.
Thank you, Councillor. So between this evening and any grant of planning permission, if there was any conversation about reducing affordable housing, that would need to come back before members, and that would be pretty quickly. So that would be in the next couple of months, I would expect. If they come back after the grant of planning permission, they can only apply to various Section 106 agreement after 5 years. So that means that the only avenue available to them would to agree to vary those planning obligations with the council. Officers have very limited powers when it comes to agreeing variations to Section 106 agreements, and that's limited to minor changes. And I imagine the strength of feeling and the nature of the affordable housing being offered here, that would be a major change that would need committee approval. So I think whether the conversations, we don't know, but should any conversations happen about viability before the grant of planning permission, that would come back here very quickly. But if it was after the grant of planning permission, they could seek to agree that change to either this permission that we're discussing this evening or the original one, or both. And that would need committee resolution given the limited powers that officers have to agree minor amendments to a Section 106.
Thank you, councillors. My speaking list here has been exhausted. Does anybody wish to make any comments before we move into debate? No, are you going to make a comment? Right, so we'll move on then to our public speakers. We have, first of all, yeah, okay, so we have nobody speaking in support of this, but we do have an objector speaking, Dr. Gillian Baker. If you could come forward, please. Dr. Baker, as I'm sure you've heard from your own position there, you need to press the right-hand button and speak clearly into the microphone, please, for everybody. Thank you.
As a community, we ask the committee, as our elected representatives, to robustly consider the differences between the two applications and the difference in the temporal landscape in which these decisions are being made. Please do not take for granted that just because 2120 out was allowed at appeal, that you necessarily have to approve this application. You don't. If this application went to appeal today, it may not be withheld, and thus your decision here today must not be taken lightly. The inspector came to the conclusion he did in good faith and an environment where we had a tilted balance. The tables have turned, and we now have 13 months more housing supply than we need. We are thus in an incredibly strong position to stick to our principles, to stick to our policies and aspirations for Exeter as a green and livable city, and to listen to the voices of the hundreds of citizens who objected to this development, the 2,000 people who petitioned to protect our Northern Hills, and those who contributed to the new local plan. We specifically ask you to consider the following. Considering that the inspector agreed that this development would cause harm to the landscape and loss of publicly valued informal green space, should the development be allowed when there is no tilted balance to offset this harm? Should the value of informal green space, opposed to formal green space and visual amenity, be overlooked in the face of growing evidence of the important role of this in health and well-being? Should we accept the weight placed on biodiversity net gain and 50% affordable housing when there has been no concrete evidence provided that this can be achieved, and there are significant questions about the validity of ecological survey methods used? Should this application have had an EIA, as it is over 5 hectare limit? Should the officers have included public comments in support when there's been an ongoing inquiry into their validity as just and true representations of the local community? The fact that the developer has pushed for this application to be formally considered means that it is in their interest and likely to be of greater value to them than an extension of 1 year. It is not for the common good of the city. It is not for the good of the residents of Exeter. As our elected representatives, we therefore ask that you ask as many questions as possible, delve into the detail, and don't sign this off as a tick box exercise. It is your opportunity to support public opinion, to stick to the principles of our current policies and the aspirations of our emerging new local plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Baker. I'll now ask members of the committee if they have questions on your presentation. I don't see any questions from us, so thank you very much indeed for your time and your very concise sticking to the time regulations. It's much appreciated. Right, I have a councillor speaking under Standing Order 44. That's Councillor Ruth Williams. Welcome, Councillor. You're well used to using these microphones and things there, but again, for the benefit of the public, if you can be as loud as possible. I also remind you that unlike the previous speaker, you do not have a time limit. However, I do ask you to be brief and concise if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not going to be as brief and concise as Dr. Baker, but my message is along the same lines. First of all, I do want to thank first Matthew Diamond and then Christopher Cummings for their work on this application and the previous appealed application. So the ones worked on the earlier one, and Christopher's worked on this particular one. This has been more than 4 years in the making, so it's a long, long time and a lot of officer time and committee time. Shall I hold it? Yeah, okay. Yes, thank you. I'll put it there. Yes, and I was a member of the planning committee that refused the previous application and was very disappointed that it was overturned on appeal. That said, you may, like me, be wondering why this fresh application, I put that in quotes, has not been withdrawn. Given the decision by the inspector to allow the previous application, which is nearly identical to this one. There appeared to me to be 2 additional material considerations for committee to bear in mind when deciding on this application. The first is that the inspector disagreed with the committee's decision on 21/0020/out, and I ask therefore, would it be professionally appropriate for an officer to go against the Secretary of State's appointed inspector? This, in my view, leaves the officers in an impossible position. Could they, in all honesty, go against the appeal decision given they recommended refusal first time round? So bear that in mind, the officers recommended refusal when I was on the committee. The second is that previously, Exeter City Council did not meet the 5-year land supply requirement, and for this reason, a tilted balance in favour of the developer applied first time round and for the appeal. However, for this application, not only do we satisfy having more than 5-year supply, this requirement has now been reduced to 4 years due to the emerging Exeter plan. So the tilted balance does not apply in this application. So those are 2 really important points for you to bear in mind. I have to say that it is worth taking members through the case made previously on the first application, because those points continue to be relevant. I want to start by acknowledging that the only real benefit of this development, that it would be to provide 50% affordable homes, with an indication that this would comprise 70% social housing. And we all know that social housing waiting lists are growing, rents are rising at their fastest rate on record, and many people are struggling to find and afford adequate housing. It is therefore deeply regrettable for me to be speaking against an application that promises to provide more affordable homes. However, this application is deeply problematic and fails on multiple fronts, and I echo the view of the planning officer at the time that harms would be caused by the proposed development strongly outweigh the benefits. I would also highlight there is no guarantee that 50% affordable housing would be delivered in this application if approved today. The developer could well turn around down the road and claim it financially it's unviable to do so, and we have had that happen before. I will now briefly outline the many ways in which this application falls well short of our policies and values and vision for sustainable development in our city, focusing on harms to landscape, character, public open space, biodiversity and environmental sustainability. So number one, harm to landscape character. This application is one in a series that have come forth in recent years to develop the distinctive rural northern hills of our city. The most recent case on land adjacent to Celia Crescent. This was refused unanimously, but when it came to committee, and subsequently the decision was reversed on appeal. I am grateful to all members for their ongoing commitment to steer development away from the ridgeline, which is subject to protection from harm in several policy documents, including paragraph 411 of the core strategy. The two fields concerned in this application, the bus stop fields, as they're known locally, are situated on especially sensitive land on this ridgeline. They occupy an elevated position and enjoy long-distance views across the city to the estuary and even out to the Torbay coast. They have a strong rural character and are sandwiched between two valley parks, Mincing Lake to the west and Savoy Hill to the east, and adjoin the ancient rural greenway of Mile Lane, which alongside Mincing Lake Park is a designated site of nature conservation importance. The site lies with the landscape setting area of the core strategy key diagram, and it's classified as Zone 3 within the 2007 Exeter Fringes study, meaning it has no capacity for housing because of its prominence, rural character and intrinsic sensitivity. This character and distinctiveness of this land is therefore protected from harm under the policy CP16, which was confirmed as carrying full weight by the Pennsylvania appeal of January 2022. There is no question that this development conflicts with CP16. To quote from the Chartered Landscape Architect instructed by the Council to carry out a review of proposals, the development would not be an organic extension to the urban area, but an incongruous piecemeal development into the rural hinterland. It would protrude beyond the natural urban edge of the city, disrupt hitherto countryside views from the site's neighbouring country parks, and effectively destroy part of the city's rural backdrop. The landscape architect was therefore unequivocal in their conclusion, shared by planning officers, that this development would be highly detrimental and conflict with CP16. It was heartening to see the dismissal of the Pennsylvania Road appeal on landscape setting grounds back in January 2022. As Matthew Diamond, planner, pointed out previously, there are many parallels to be drawn between these sites, and the appeal decision is therefore a material consideration, not least because this site is arguably even more sensitive and because we are talking about 100 houses and not 26. Number two, loss of public open space. It is pertinent to note, as outlined in the committee report, that private land can also be recognised as publicly accessible space in planning terms.
Such is the case of this site, which has been freely used for recreation by residents for generations. As part of their representation, the Exeter Green Spaces Group collected a series of testimonies from residents about the role of these fields had played in their lives. We hear from residents who recall playing in these fields as children and who now take their own children there. Those who picked blackberries, apples, those who had picnics and walks with neighbours. Some residents described walking on these fields for over 60 years, and not one of the 12 respondents ever recalled seeing a fence boundary the land in all their time there. That was until January 2021, when the earlier planning application was submitted. We also hear how these fields are an important sanctuary for residents, providing space from claustrophobic flats and helping residents with their physical and mental health. Losing these fields for recreation would be devastating to the local community. The application does not acknowledge this decades-long history of public use in their planning application, nor does it address policy L3, which stipulates the loss of public open space must be compensated for by open space at least equivalent recreational, community, ecological, or amenity value. If we assume that there is provision for open space on the northern parts of the field, as officers have done, it is clear that this does not meet the criteria of L3. It is smaller than the area that would be lost to the development and would have far less value for residents once its rural nature is irreversibly altered. Once again, on public open space, this application fails. 3, harm to trees and biodiversity. This site is a biodiversity haven and an important wildlife corridor for neighbouring Mincing Lake Valley Park. It figures in the Green Infrastructure Study, and the Southern Hedge Bank is part of the SNCI. Protected species surveys found that at least 11 bat species using the site for foraging and commuting. There has been evidence of badgers using the site, and small populations of slowworm and lizards have also been recorded. Residents' testimonies also paint a picture of land buzzing with wildlife, including glowworms, foxes, deer, rabbits, field mice, butterflies, and birds, including owls and jays. The fields are also home to a broad array of established trees up to 17 metres tall, including mature and early mature oaks, as well as field maples, turkey oak, and ash. Many of the trees described above would need to be removed to create accesses from Pendragon Road and from the west. While it's judged on paper that this loss could be compensated for by new planting scheme, in practice, the removal of such established trees will have a devastating impact on the biodiversity of the site. The removal of trees from the southern treed hedge bank would weaken the applicant's proposed mitigation of creating dark buffer areas to maintain connectivity for bats. 2 of the trees identified for this are close to the southern access and will be disturbed by now visible street lights and passing car headlights. This will undoubtedly have a negative impact on the field's residents, bats, and all other wildlife. Finally, residents informed us that they saw the fields as being stripped prior to the surveys being undertaken. Add to this the fact that some surveys are missing, and it's clear that we cannot establish a solid baseline of the current biodiversity value of this site, let alone capture its full potential for wildlife. The environmental impact statement is missing some surveys and therefore cannot establish a solid baseline. Further, residents inform us that those surveys that were carried out significantly underestimate the ecological value of the site, given that they observe the fields being mechanically stripped in the lead up to the survey. On biodiversity, then, this application falls once again, and it would harm biodiversity on a site that significantly includes an SNCI, and as such conflicts with policy CP16 and policy LS4. Number 4, harm to environmental sustainability. Finally, it is this matter of fact that the high hills of this part of the city coupled with the scarcity of local amenities, mean that any housing development will necessarily be car-led. You've only to look at the applicant's transport statement to see this, with 2 parking spaces being provided per house, clearly conflicting with local plan policy T10, which imposes a maximum 1.5 spaces per dwelling. The Highways Authority also commented that the transport statement underestimated the number of additional peak hour movements that would be generated by this development. Devon Highways rightly pointed out in their March 2021 objection that ECC have declared carbon neutral aspirations by 2030 and DCC have declared a climate emergency. Therefore, any applicant should promote sustainable transport modes. And yet, there is woeful provision in this application to support safe, active travel. Exeter Cycling Campaign highlights that the cycling infrastructure referenced in transport statement is 700 metres away from the site on Beacon Lane, requiring a journey down the narrow roads of King Arthur's or Lancelot to join up with this. At the present time, Devon Highways is also still not satisfied that the applicant has met concerns about the lack of pedestrian connection to the local bus stop or footway cycling link from the development into Mincing Lake Park. In addition, while there may be a bus stop near the site, as we've discussed before, we cannot rely on a private company to make this application sustainable, and certainly not at a time when routes are cut and routinely delayed. The reality is therefore that the development will create more congestion and emissions at a time when we need urgently to reduce them. It would undermine our net zero goals and would stand squarely against core strategy objectives 1 and 5 that seek to limit the use of fossil fuels, encouraging walking and cycling, and reduce car dependency. So finally, in conclusion, of course we need to build housing, but have a responsibility towards current and future residents that we build well-connected, healthy and sustainable communities too. One of ECC's 3 strategic priorities is to build great neighbourhoods with vibrant and dynamic local centres, an imperative that is also reflected in our core strategy vision, in which we will aspire to create sustainable communities that are safe places offering opportunities for everyone, where environment is respected, and with housing amenities, schools, hospitals and transport links that people need to live well. This development would not achieve this. It would put further strain on already overstretched amenities and would harm our net zero goals. So it would undermine our plans for active travel and would fly in the face of long-standing commitment to steer development away from our rural ridgeline. It would be a disservice to current and future Exeter residents. So please remember, Exeter exceeded the housing delivery test by 155% in 2021. And we currently have a healthy housing supply of 5 years, 1 month and counting. So it's pertinent to note that the Pennsylvania appeal was dismissed despite our not having a full 5 years. And in this case, as with that, the significant harms posed to the landscape, biodiversity, open space and an environment presented by this development clearly and significantly outweigh its limited benefits. So I therefore ask you to refuse this development today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm now inviting questions from members. Starting with Councillor Ketchin.
Why do you think the application has come forward, given they've already got planning approval? What do you see as the benefit to the plan, so to speak, from the developer's point of view?
I think the pertinent question is why the developers have not withdrawn the application, because this application was put in before the outcome of the appeal. The appeal went in their favour. So yes, I leave it to you to think why. Why do they want to go ahead with this? It's taking a considerable amount of officer time. It's taking a considerable amount of committee time. They had their decision from the inspector, which we disagreed with, and now I think the situation has changed, and it could well be that had it gone to appeal now, that because of the tilted balance not applying, then it could have failed as appeal. So I have my own views, which I think I will keep to myself. And I would ask every member of this committee to ask that question. Why has this developer decided not to withdraw this?
Anybody else with questions for Councillor Williams? Okay, I don't see anybody. Thank you very much indeed, Councillor, for your very comprehensive comments. I shall now pass over to the Director for a summary.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll try and speak loud so everybody here. I'm not going to repeat everything that's been heard this evening, and certainly not the officer's assessment of the application. I just want to really draw your attention really to the most pertinent aspects of this application this evening. As all of you will be aware, by law, planning applications must be determined in accordance with the development plan, firstly, and then unless there are material considerations otherwise. So in this case, both the planning inspectors and your officers are in agreement that this application does conflict with the adopted local plan, in particular policy CP16. So in that situation, we're in what I describe as the world of what are these other material considerations that could outweigh the policy. The first one does no longer apply. That is the tilted balance. That was applicable for the appeal, but as we've heard and as your officers have confirmed, that no longer applies. So the tilted balance is no longer a material consideration. The other two, I would say, significant material considerations, though, firstly, are the planning inspectorate's view about the harm that this application would cause in terms of the landscape setting. Those planning inspectors considered that harm would be moderate only. And the reason for that was that they felt that the harm would essentially be within the site, and that medium and long distance views wouldn't be significantly impacted. That was their view. The other key material consideration is, notwithstanding that, is the other benefits that this application would bring. In particular, the planning inspectors gave substantial weight to the affordable housing, which was above the local plan requirement. They also gave significant weight to some of the other benefits, including the provision of public open space and biodiversity net gain. So those are all the additional material considerations that you have to weigh up and balance, given that this proposal is contrary to the local plan. And it's really for you to give that now your consideration, and in particular, what weight you want to give as a planning commission to those various considerations that I've listed. And that will then would need to form your decision. So you need to weigh up very carefully all of the factors that are in play, that are material, that would potentially give you the remit to go against your own policies effectively. And those are the things that you've got to consider in making your decision this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Right, we're now moving into a debate, and so I'm inviting speakers on this. Anybody want to start us off? Councillor Mitchell and Councillor Hugh.
Thank you, Chair. This is, as I said, a very unusual application scenario to be in, with one extent application, one at appeal, one that looks hardly any different that's coming to us this evening with a recommendation to accept. And also we know the issue, as we pointed out, outlined, this is with access provision, and we know there are issues relating to access to the site, which will cause problems for the developer. So we're in this sort of troubled, muddy waters to know what to do. But I go back initially to the appeal decision, as the director pointed out. What were the significant factors that that inspector took into account? And at that time, we as a committee and the officers were refusing that application. The inspector looked at it, and at that particular point in time, I think we're always going to remember there's that point of time that they're working in, he chose a range of factors which he believed outweighed the points that we were making. Except it's not right and wrong, it's just a balancing act. And some of these are points that we now, as I say, we now need to revisit and find out whether our initial view on this site was right, and whether, in the light of what has happened in the preceding time, some of the substantial points the inspector made, in our view, as lay people, are no longer that substantial. So therefore, we might not wish to go with the officer's recommendation. The prime one here, listed in the order that the inspectors put them here, the first one is housing land. They're arguing between 4 and 4.1 at that time. We needed 5 at that time. It's like a lost deposit in the general election, but it was a very below general election levels on that one. We're now arguing that we've got 5.1. And we know that in other appeals, developers try to chip away at that by trying to knock sites out. And that's quite clear in the Pennsylvania report, where the inspector was also, yes, you count that one in, you can't count that one in, which led to a lower figure. But clearly, as long as the temporary arrangement on 4 years remains, we have got a substantial buffer to see us through if we decided to refuse and there was an appeal. So in effect, that tilted balance has now gone in the favour of the local authority and not in favour of the developer. The second point, which he said was substantial weight, was one we've already discussed, of the affordable housing. And as I say, it is normally difficult in planning applications as a member of the planning committee to get developers up to 35%. And we know some government regulations only state 20%, and even then there are issues. So whilst it's welcome that we will allegedly get 50%, I'm somewhat personally dubious of whether that will be achieved on the viability rulings. And having had viability rulings come to us in the past, what we have found out, it comes down to money at the end of the day, and whether they can produce the financial arguments that says we cannot sustain that level of social or affordable housing on the site. And then the matter is dealt with in that way. So I'm dubious on that one, giving that substantial weight that was given to it by the inspector. The third point that was substantial or significant was the biodiversity net gain. And here again, it was proposed 10%, I think 5% is the normal ruling. So again, we're getting a generosity on behalf of the developer. And the interesting statement I see from the inspector in that paragraph 33 is, I see no reason why this could not be achieved. That doesn't sound like a cast iron guarantee to me. It is not as strong as it could be. And I sometimes wonder at the end of the day whether we'll get that 10%. The last point that they said was significant, which I find the most unusual one to state, is that it's going to create short-term employment prospects for people involved in the construction. Well, any construction site would do that, surely. To me, that is a taken on any development site. And also there'll be some longer-term jobs in relation to the drainage work working on the campus, and also improved economic factors locally by more people living in the area. And that was significant. I don't believe that is a significant factor. We as a committee have to say to ourselves, do we believe we were correct in the first place when the first application came through, when we rejected it on the officer's recommendation? Have these points that were substantial at that time changed significantly or altered in any way, which would lead us to go against our original refusal and now come for acceptance of the application? And the point is, at the end of the day, the previous application is approved. They have their planning permission. This is the unusual nature of this one. I'm just interested that we're not discussing this tomorrow night, when the minister tomorrow is making all the changes to the planning regulations. So it'll be interesting to see whether this has been an academic exercise this evening, and we wait to see what happens tomorrow. But I am not changing my view from the one I made at the original application. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hughes.
Thank you. I just needed to, for my own peace of mind, to make a couple of points because, you know, I very much respect the opinion of the officers and will always take that into consideration. However, I can't fathom how we can keep this area safe. I'm looking at the plans, I'm looking at the public open space. I can see that becoming almost ghettoized. I can see that becoming something that Exeter City Council will have to spend money to fix. I can see that the developer might take their money and run and leave us to clean up and take care of the public open space, because obviously we're going to want to make sure that those residents have access to that green open space for all the reasons that Ruth, Councillor Williams mentioned. I have looked at what the police have commented in the consultations about lighting, about access, and so on and so forth. So I'm taking that into account when I'm making that point. The other thing I've looked at as well is the fire brigade have an opinion on this that does not appear to be entirely in favour. And I don't feel that we have discussed enough what other services have mentioned, like the fire service, like the police service. I can't see how this is going to be a safe area. And I did very much appreciate Officer Cummings' response to my question about the Section 106 protecting that public open space and there being a point of contact. But I think there are too many examples in this city where developers have just disappeared and not maintained publicly accessible areas. So I just don't feel enough information has been given to me for me to want to. I'm not even sure how to vote at this point, because I just don't feel that things have been answered satisfactorily about how this is going to be kept safe, how it's not going to be a financial nightmare for Exeter City Council parks and open spaces. I don't feel how it's not going to cost us money as a council to maintain this.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Ketchin.
We heard about from the officers why this was a sustainable site, and we heard from two speakers why it wasn't a sustainable site. My view is it's not a sustainable site, having listened to both sides of the argument. I think it's not sustainable on three grounds. There's the obvious one that's already been spoken to, and I'll not go into again about the natural environment, and that's been well discussed. But it's sandwiched between two valley parks, and in other cities that I've lived in, councils have had an ambition to change these sort of hill areas and link them up with valley parks and sort of develop these natural assets. And that doesn't seem to be an ambition here. It's not for the planning committee, but it is a sort of we should think aspirationally in terms of when we think about what is sustainable for our city. So the other sort of elements of sustainability about cityscape. I mean, this is essentially low density sprawl or creep on a hillside without local amenities easily within touch. It's very car dependent. I think the councillor already said, and I agree with that. That you know, from a cityscape point of view, it's not a brownfield site, and we've not heard anything about the Exeter local plan tonight, but I do understand that has come along since the original application. That does carry some weight. It's not been emphasised tonight, but it does have some weight, and there's very clear aspiration to develop brownfield sites in the Exeter local plan. And then just lastly, the sort of social element of sustainability. You're locking people in to lifestyles that are constrained on a peripheral hilly site, and you know, we don't need to go around the houses on that. I've touched on that, and as have others. So I think there's nothing sustainable about this site, and there's sustainability is a big factor in other applications that are talked about in the city, and they do get preferential weighting. I think of Water Lane and other big projects to come in terms of sustainability. So I'll be voting against on the grounds that it's not sustainable, and I think that will be material consideration if the committee so decides.
Thank you, Councillor. Anybody else wishing to speak? Councillor Patrick.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, we've heard an awful lot of objections to this development, and I have to say that I agree with an awful lot of them. It's not a development. It's not an application that I admire or I would like to see. However, my concern is the implications of if this committee refused this application, where the previous one went to appeal and we lost at appeal, the sort of implications of that. So as I envision the situation would be either this would go to appeal and there'd be a high chance that we'd lose the appeal, or the developer would just go back to the original application. So which I find very frustrating and problematic given the nature of this development, but that's my concern. So I just wanted to raise that.
Thank you, Councillor. So anybody else? Councillor Pole.
So I'm hearing the comments from Councillor Patrick, and this is a possibility that does raise quite a lot of anxiety, because we don't want to be involved as a city council in expensive and unnecessary appeals. However, it is very difficult to see the case for approving this application when the arguments were put by the officers and the previous committee findings on the previous application. The applications are very similar, and this application really only serves to extend the time that the applicant has to make its to break its ground on the site. I think that wouldn't be a good precedent, because why wouldn't all applicants put in 2 applications in that case? I don't think that's a good precedent to set. I do think that we did have the landscape experts' positions on the visual and landscape impacts, and my own observations are that there is an impact, and I don't really personally perceive that to be a moderate impact. And there is a reason why we have strategies, and I think piecemeal development in our northern hills, really does seriously and fundamentally undermine our strategies. I can tell you I'm a ward councillor in the ward, and there is not a lot of active travel. You do not see people walking up from Beacon Heath. You do not see a lot of people getting off the bus. You do see a lot of people driving their cars and weaving in and out of other parked cars, because there are a lot of cars up there. Although this particular piece of this particular neighbourhood up at Beacon Heath has greater access to green space than some of the other areas in our ward, the reason it has greater access is because it's close to the countryside. And if we build more housing up there on the ridge, that just pushes that countryside further away from some of our residents that are further down the hill, and there's less chance that they and their families will grow up with that access to nature that, you know, is so clearly and on the evidence going to give them the greater chance in life for well-being and for leadership and success and social mobility. So yeah, I also, like some of the other councillors, do have some serious concerns about the sustainability of the site. We're not in an area of employment in that ward, and a lot of commuting is done by car. So I think also the tilted balance is important. And so yeah, I'm quite conflicted, but I do think that there are some serious material considerations, particularly the landscape setting and the visual impact, but also the sustainability.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Asvashi.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I personally didn't like the first application, and I'm very disappointed it got overturned at appeal. However, it seems to me that the choice we have before us today is we either approve or don't approve this scheme, and that just means the developer goes back and uses the old scheme which they want to appeal. So we really need to decide whether we prefer the old scheme, which we refused, or the new scheme, which we may or may not choose. And if we don't choose it, they'll just go and use the old one. So like everyone else, it's very, very difficult. I personally didn't like the first one either, but it's the lesser of two evils, as far as I can tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'd like to go to Councillor Miller.
Thank you, Chair. I won't go over all the points that have already been mentioned, but like my fellow councillors, I am quite conflicted on this. A key consideration for me, like has been mentioned before, is the fact that it conflicts with the local plan, and we do now have a 4-year housing supply. On the other hand, the public open space and the 50% affordable housing is a positive. I don't know for me if it mitigates for the impact. But like Councillor Swashen has said, what we're choosing in between is an appeal application that they've already had granted versus this application tonight. And the only difference I can see is that the public open space will be formalised through the changing of the red line. So, I mean, for me, that's partly what this is hanging on. And so, yeah, I'm conflicted. That's where I'm at. I don't know if that's enough for me.
Thank you, Councillor. Does anybody else wish to speak at the moment? I'd like to make a contribution, if I may. The whole essence of our being as a planning committee is one of balance. With the original application, it was very finely balanced until this so-called tilted balance came in and crashed it all down on one side. The committee decided to refuse it. It went to appeal, and that appeal was upheld. This means now that we have to look at exactly the same application, but without that tilt. So effectively, we have an exact balance, and we do have to look if we are minded to refuse this, at exactly what our reasons are. And if you, as a committee, do decide to refuse this, you must please bear that in mind, that we must instruct the officers exactly what the reasons are, bearing in mind that the CP16 argument, the L3, LS4 and T10 arguments have already been used at an appeal and were found wanting by an inspector. Now, I have no idea whether it's like a mistrial, and if it goes back to another appeal, whether we'll get a different inspector, and that inspector might have different inclinations. But I personally have looked very carefully at this. I will tell you to what extent I looked into it. I went back to the original recording of the planning committee and listened to all of the arguments from those members who were on that committee at that time, and for others who have spoken to us, in order to try and understand the history of this. And I really cannot find, despite the fact that this obviously contradicts our emerging local plan, that local plan is not in place yet. And I still find it not possible for me to overrule the officer's opinion in this. So if I am the final speaker, we'll look for, is that something up for you, or are we going to go straight to? We're going to go straight, yeah. So if anybody else wishes to speak, please do so now. I don't see any hands there, so therefore I am going to propose the motion that the committee approve the recommendation of the officer to approve this application. I'm asking for a seconder, please. I have a seconder from Councillor Patrick. I'm now moving to a vote. I want you to indicate clearly, please, are you in favour of the motion in front of you? Okay. Now asking, are you against the motion, please?
That's 5 against.
Right, I have a vote of 6-5, and therefore by the narrowest of margin, this motion is passed. It's carried, yes. All right, this has been a long and very difficult debate. I do again wish to very much thank the members of the public for coming along. I do hope that you feel that your voices have at least been listened to, even if we didn't manage to get to the opinion that you wished. I'm now calling for a 5-minute recess for us to have a refreshment, walk around, some fresh air. If any members of the public wish to stay for the second and subsequent items, we have other members of the public who wish to come in and take your places if not. Thank you all. We can come to order, please. We're now on to the agenda item number 6. This is planning application 23/1380/OUT. This is land to the north of Exeter, Stoke Hill, Exeter. Can we have a report from the officer, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just grab this. This application is for outline planning permission for up to 85 dwellings, including 35% affordable housing, retention of the existing barn for use as a community hub, and associated infrastructure. All matters are reserved apart from the access. The application site itself is 4.88 hectares of agricultural land, and it's currently split into 2 fields. There's an existing vehicle access on the western boundary onto Stoke Hill, and the large agricultural barn in the centre of the site. The site itself forms part of a wider agricultural holding that extends to the northeast. There's been 303 representations on this application, 302 of which objected and 1 supported. They're set out in full in the, summarised in the officer report, so I won't go into them now. There were objections from a number of consultees that included the following aspects. In relation to urban design and landscape, that the scheme would be detrimental to the landscape setting and character of the city. It relates poorly to the adjacent settlement form and is not a strong contribution to the rural edge of the context and setting of the location. Devon County Council Highways considered that the submitted information did not adequately demonstrate accurate trip generations and that there would be a reliance on private motor vehicles and associated increase in highway safety impacts. The council's ecologist advised that insufficient survey work on bat roosts was submitted, that a phase 2 habitat survey was required, and that the 43.7% biodiversity net gain loss had not been adequately compensated, and that on-site light levels, as well as those for the proposed footway, would need to be considered. The council's tree manager objected due to significant harm to a veteran oak tree located by the vehicle entrance. Devon Wildlife Trust objected as some of the protected species survey was out of date, also due to the 4 county wildlife sites close to the site and the proximity of Stoke Woods site of special scientific interest. They also referenced the lighting strategy, the lack of lighting strategy, inadequate biodiversity net gain, and functionality impacts on the green infrastructure network. The Exeter Civic Society objected due to the detachment of the scheme from the built environment and the poor connection to the city. They also noted there are conflicts with policy CP16, which aims to protect the hills to the north. They also noted that the density levels would fail to make a good use of the site. An Exeter Cycling Campaign objected due to the danger for cyclists on Stoke Hill. As before, as with the other scheme, this is an illustrative layout, and it should be noted that only the access is proposed. I will quickly outline the accesses because the indicative plan has changed slightly during the application process. So the vehicular access is onto Stoke Hill using the existing point. It's just north of the existing barn, which you can see outlined in hatching at the very bottom middle of that screen. The pedestrian access is proposed in the southwestern corner of the site onto the sharp bend at Stoke Hill. This is a revised version. The original version had steps, but that was then removed and a longer slope access route has been proposed. There's not currently a safe and accessible footway for pedestrians to link with the wider city, such as to the bus stop on Mincing Lake Road. It's therefore proposed to install a footway along Stoke Hill, leading south all the way up to join Mincing Lake Road. I appreciate that last slide was quite zoomed out, so this is the first part of it by the connection to the application site. It still shows the steps on this plan I have here. And then that is the extent of the footway that would be along Stoke Hill going up the hill again. I'll go into that in a bit more detail when we get onto the highway section. The site is within the Northern Hills landscape setting area, and core strategy policy CS1 states that development should be steered away from the hills to the north and the northwest that are strategically important to the landscape setting of the city. As set out in the report, local plan policy LS1 requires that proposals do not harm the landscape setting of the city and that they are integrated into the existing landscape. It's acknowledged this policy has got a reduced weight due to national policy changes and appeal decisions. However, parts of it are still relevant. And core strategy policy CP16 states that specific areas of the city, including the hills to the north, will only be appropriate for development if it protects the character and local distinctiveness of the area. The emerging Exeter plan, which whilst having very limited weight at this time, also states that in policy NE1, that development can only occur where there is no harm to the undeveloped character, natural beauty or quality of views, or the distinctive characteristics or special features. So there's also county wildlife sites either side of the site, and it is surrounded in part by Mincing Lake Valley Park. The site itself has been subject to 2 separate landscape studies and 2 housing and economic land availability assessments, all of which concluded that the site is not suitable for housing or for employment due to the high sensitivity of the area. So the 2007 study included the site within the pretty large Zone 3. And then the 2022 study was much smaller and is within Zone 5. Both studies concluded that the site was not suitable for housing or employment due to the impact on the landscape setting and the rural nature of the Northern Hills. A landscape and visual impact assessment was submitted with the application, and this was followed up by a statement in response to initial objections raised by the council's urban design and landscape officer. This application itself is a resubmission of a withdrawn application. The previous scheme was slightly larger, but as part of that, the council commissioned an independent consultant to assess it. And whilst the red line has changed, it's considered that the conclusions drawn from the consultant that the overall site is not suitable for development due to the landscape harm is still relevant and appropriate for this scheme. The council's urban design and landscape officer raised objections to the scheme, noting that the essential nature of the proposal can clearly be seen to be an isolated development form, poorly connected to the existing structure of the existing neighbourhoods, positioned in the green space that provides a natural subdivision of the urban structure. Embracing the agricultural uses, valley park and mature wooded hillsides, this coherent element of green infrastructure represents a fundamental characteristic of this part of the city. The submitted LVIA included a number of visualizations showing existing, proposed and 15-year views, with 15-year views looking to demonstrate what would happen once planting has matured. So this is an example of the existing with the building. You can't really see it in this one. And then in 15 years, you can just see in the middle, there's a bit of green where the planting would have grown up. The majority of the visuals appeared to show that the site would be screened by planting. However, there were some significant concerns over visualization 03. And this one in particular, this is the existing situation. This is set to the east of the site, looking towards the west. And I appreciate it might be difficult to see on this screen, but you can see the buildings appearing there. And then the planting sort of appears either side of it, but doesn't actually do any screening of the development itself. There was also significant concerns from the council's urban design and landscape officer that this helps demonstrate that the associated light spill from the development would be significant and change the character of the area from the rural current nature. It's also noted that the viewpoints proposed don't include any views from the residential area to the southwest of the site, which is noted as being within the zone of high theoretical visibility. So on zone left, on the slide, on the left is the zone of theoretical visibility. On the right is the viewpoints they chose. And as you can see, there is nothing to the southwest of the site that has been used as a direct viewpoint. Having visited those areas, these are some photos of what can be seen from the roads and from a residential property in the area. So we have Oldham Road, where you can see the barn and existing southern field. That's from a residential property on Armstrong Avenue that was kind enough to let me in. This is from the highway by 17 Widdicombe Way. And this is from the furthest point of Widdicombe Way, adjacent to where Stoke Hill starts going down. So you can see the rural context of the existing site and how visible it will be from that direction. Overall, it is considered that the development would harm the character and local distinctiveness of the hills to the north of the city and the landscape setting. It would create a piecemeal urban development on a greenfield site in the designated landscape setting area that would be visible from adjoining public spaces and public and private routes and spaces within the wider urban area. It would appear incongruous and not in keeping with the rural character of the hillside and Mincing Lake Valley Park. It's therefore considered contrary to policy CP16 of the core strategy, the spatial element of Safe Policy LS1 of the local plan, and paragraphs 135C and 180A of the National Planning Policy Framework. So moving on to the access, as I showed earlier, there's the vehicular access proposed using the existing access point. This itself has raised no significant objections from DCC highways, and it has been demonstrated with swept path analysis that larger vehicles would be able to enter the site. The pedestrian access, as I said earlier, was proposed to be via stepped route. However, this wouldn't have been accessible to all, and it's now proposed to install a sloped route throughout the site. It has been shown to have a gradient of no greater than 1 in 10, which is the acceptable level. But it is considered that there would likely be a need for flat space to be offered to allow for resting places for users of it, and this has not been demonstrated at this time. This matter may be able to be overcome, but as set out in the additional information sheet, it would still need to be resolved at this stage, as access is part of this application. Due to the revised access plans being submitted close to the committee date and the other refusal reasons, it was not considered appropriate to request further changes to this from the applicant. So in terms of the proposed footway, it is quite a significant new footway that would be installed. It would go from the bend on Stoke Hill to connect up with the crossing at Mincing Lake Valley Park into the car park there. And would then continue from the bottom end of Mincing Lake Valley Park going all the way up Stoke Hill to connect with the existing footway just before Mincing Lake Road. There is a steep gradient on this road which could lead to accessibility issues, but it was noted by highways that there is an existing carriageway and highway land, and that needs to be taken into account when assessing it. That being said, no gradient details were submitted for this footway, and as access is a matter for consideration, it is necessary to understand whether an acceptable and accessible route can actually be provided for occupants to reduce reliance on private motor vehicles. As with the on-site access, this proposed footway was submitted at a late stage, and it wasn't considered appropriate to require additional information from the applicant, as it wouldn't overcome the other refusal reasons. In terms of highway safety, a second technical note that was submitted included swept path analysis for Stoke Hill, in particular for the where the pedestrian route would join Stoke Hill there. It was confirmed by Devon County Council Highways that it was technically possible for vehicles to use that area safely, but there were still concerns over the tight corner where the pedestrian access meets the footway. It was noted by them that it might be technically possible to overcome with curbs, and this concept of technically possible is an issue when assessing this application, with access to be considered as part of it. We would therefore need it to be demonstrated that it could be safe, rather than that it's technically possible to put something safe in. As with the previous two aspects, this part was submitted quite late in the proceeding, and revised details were not requested from the applicant in relation to them. In terms of trip generation, that must also be considered. The submitted transport assessment originally used a site near Beacon Lane as a comparison, and this was not considered suitable as it was close to bus, cycle and walking links. A first transport technical note was then submitted, which used the second technical note was submitted, which used St Bridget's Nursery as a comparison site. Again, this was not considered suitable to use as a comparison for trip generation, as St Bridget's Nursery is close to cycle and pedestrian links, as well as the Ryden Lane Retail Park. A more accurate site comparison is therefore needed, potentially from outside of Exeter, if there are no suitable sites within it to use as a comparison. It's also noted that the trip calculations don't include any details for users, workers, or delivery to the community hub building. This is of significance as any retail use of the community hub would rely on its external visitors to be viable. And this would therefore see additional vehicle movements to the site and associated highway safety impacts. So overall, in terms of highway considerations, it's considered that the location of the site itself on the edge of the city, detached from the surrounding built form, facilities, and with a steep topography, means that there will be a reliance on private motor vehicle for both residents and visitors, which would lead to an associated increase in highway safety issues. And that would be contrary to local plan policies T1, T2, T3, H2, DG1, and core strategy policy CP4. So as I mentioned before, the site is in quite a sensitive area in terms of nature. It's positioned immediately next to Mincing Lake Valley Park, and therefore has the potential to significantly impact on this site of nature conservation importance. It's also got county wildlife sites adjacent to it, and the Valley Park itself. The council's ecologist objected to the proposal for a number of reasons. One of them was that updated bat surveys would be required on roosting bats. There was also the need for a phase 2 habitat survey and demonstration that there would be possible to have an overall biodiversity net gain. In addition, details of lighting levels would be required both on site and along the proposed Stoke Hill footway, as this could have significant impact on bats. It's acknowledged that these aspects could be resolved, but due to the time required for full surveys to be undertaken and the in-principle refusal reasons for this proposal, it was again not considered appropriate to delay decision-making on this application any further. The applicant's submitted documents also note that they could provide land to the north to create public open space to help for mitigation. This has not been included formally as part of this application and is only referred to as a possible option in the documents. Even if this was included, it's considered that the significant harm to the landscape setting would not be mitigated adequately by the provision of this. In conclusion, the lack of survey information, biodiversity net gain, and the lighting impacts mean that the application fails to demonstrate that there will not be significant harm to the biodiversity through habitat loss, priority bat species, county wildlife sites, and important wildlife corridors. As a result of habitat loss and or degradation from lighting, habitat removal, and recreational pressure. The proposal would be contrary to local plan safety policy LS4, core strategy policy CP16, and MPPF paragraphs 180A and D and 186A and D. Staying on the biodiversity aspects, the submitted arboricultural assessment noted a veteran oak tree close to the vehicle entrance. I appreciate it's a bit of a colourful plan there, but the light blue lines show the extent of the pedestrian footway, and the dark blue line there shows the proposed vehicle area. This access route would be within the route protection zone and would cause unacceptable harm to that tree. Whilst the footpath aspect of it could be dealt with via a no-dig or cellular construction for that footway, the actual vehicular highway would still require digging and an impermeable surface to meet County Council requirements. The tree manager has discussed this with the applicants, arboriculturists, went on site with them and continued their objection to the loss of or the harm to this tree. The proposal is therefore unacceptable due to significant harm to the veteran tree, contrary to policy CP16 of the core strategy, policy DG1 of the local plan, and paragraphs 180 and 186 of the NPPF. In relation to other matters for this proposal, in terms of drainage, it's been demonstrated that it is possible for a suitable drainage scheme to be installed with the details to be dealt with at reserved matters. There would be a requirement for 10% public open space to be secured. And in terms of nearby dwellings, there would be limited amenity impacts to it. There would, however, be amenity impact to Mincing Lake Valley Park itself through the development of this. Air quality impacts could not be confirmed at this time as the trip generation hasn't been fully demonstrated. However, this would be able to be dealt with via condition at the reserved matter stage. In terms of Section 106 obligations, as set out in the report, there would be a requirement for contributions towards GP surgery expansion, highway improvements at Stoke Hill roundabout and the E3 cycle route. There would be provision of a lap and a leap play area and a contribution towards an off-site mugger. And there would also be a requirement for 35% affordable housing and habitat regulations contribution for recreational impacts to protected European marine sites for the affordable housing aspect. In assessing the overall planning balance, there are benefits to the scheme. There is the 35% affordable housing. There are the improvements to Stoke Hill roundabout, the provision of play areas and employment. However, as set out in this report and in this presentation, the location of this site in the Northern Hills generates significant harm to the landscape setting area. The edge of city location will see a reliance on private motor vehicles with associated safety impacts. And it's not clear what the ecological and biodiversity harms will be, with the exception of the veteran oak tree that's been demonstrated there will be unacceptable harm to. The submit documents make reference to recent appeals in the nearby area at Pendragon Road and Spruce Close. But as you've seen in the report and as you've been discussing, they were approved under the tilted balance in favour of development, and that is no longer the case. It should also be noted that, as set out in the report, there have been appeals that were dismissed in the landscape setting areas that need to be taken into account. Therefore, the overall proposal is considered to generate significant harm for the refusal reasons set out at the end of the report, and it's recommended to this committee for refusal. Thank you.
Thank you. Now inviting questions, starting off with Councillor Hughes.
I have two questions, if I may, Chair. My first question relates to the proposed pedestrian and cycle access. I wonder if you would mind just skimming back to that section on the PowerPoint. Chair, may I just get up and point to something on the screen?
Almost welcome to point, Councillor Hughes.
Can somebody explain to me why we're going all the way around here and not there? What would be the reasoning behind that?
Yes, so if I go to this slide, and I'll just go up there and point a second. So I can take my phone with me. So you can just about see here that that is the original proposed access point, and that was stepped access only. So that was the only way into the site because of the deep topography of the area, and it would fail to meet policy requirements for accessible housing developments. So the topography of the site is such that the only way for them to I've gone the wrong way. That way. So the only way to get an acceptable gradient for the route in as a path with no steps is to take it around that southern route and skirt around the proposed drainage basin.
So just like as part of that same question then, what I'm hearing is that there isn't any access for people who do not use motorised mobility aids, because actually that's an incredibly long way around, it looks to me, and I'm not seeing how that's going to be helpful for people that use, for example, crutches or walking sticks, or who are elderly and infirm. That literally only gives accessible access to the very able and those in electric mobility scooters and chairs. Have I made a correct assumption there, in your opinion?
I would say that from my colleague in the highway department, that it is an accessible route, but it is long. And that's why we, as I said in the presentation, we would be looking for resting areas and other aspects like that to be included in such a design. But there is, in one of the refusal reasons, the fact that the topography of the area is such that there will be a reliance on private motor vehicles caused by this scheme.
Brilliant, thank you. And my very quick second question relates to the landscape setting area slide, which I also just need to get in front of me. So again, if I just could go to the, this is as much for those in the audience as well as for me. So is this where the Agenda 5 development is going to be taking place, here in this box?
That is correct, yes.
Great, thank you.
Okay, any more questions to the office, please? Councillor Ketch.
One for Ben, please. Can you give me a sort of this hill's one of the steepest in Exeter, to my mind. It's quite narrow as well, and it's full of bends and short views of access to a vehicle in particular, because it will move a lot faster. But I think it gets a fair bit of bike traffic from all the sort of the Lycra crew, and I'm kind of curious as to what kind of traffic study's been done on it. I didn't see any figures about accidents and any perception about heavy vehicle use coming out of the site onto what's quite a difficult, a narrow, twisting road that's steep. I didn't get a sense that, given that access is one of the key things we're trying to discuss here, what the safety or thought or what prudence there was for that access point.
So just to clarify, that's specifically relating just to the access point rather than the continuing the Stoke Road down in towards Exeter. Yeah. So the access itself provides sufficient visibility as per manual for streets for the required speed limit, or the posted speed limit, which was a 2.4 metre setback with a 43 metre visibility display in either direction. The applicant has been able to provide that. So in terms of the access visibility, from our point of view, has been covered, and those points are there. Now, those visibility displays were to the near side carriageway edge, which would pick up any cyclists who were going along that section of the carriageway.
Any other councillors with questions to the officers, please? Right, so we'll move to the speakers. Okay, so I have no speaker in support, but I do have an objector. Mr. Francis Hallam, could you please approach? Good evening, Mr. Hallam. That's it, you know the thing there. And,
This is very short. Let me know if you can hear. May I begin by commending Christopher Cummings on dealing with the Herculean task that he has faced in summarising over 300 often erudite and passionate objections to this application. The developer was previously, as said, responsible for a withdrawn application for the same site, which attracted 390 objections and one supporter. The job has now been done, and you have all the reports and findings. I wish to ensure that this does not reoccur. At personal time and expense, we have visited and leafleted thousands of homes, protested on the highway, and arranged public events as successive applications have arrived. This began in September 2019. I think we were all born by then, when a barn suddenly appeared on this site with only 2 people aware enough to question its arrival. Prior approval was apparently not required for an agricultural building for storage of produce and machinery on one of the most prominent sites on Exeter's protected Northern Hills, even though it was located nearly a mile from Rixlade Farm, where there was adequate space for it to take place. It was accompanied by an incorrect statement that it would not be visible from any highway, footpath, etc. It can be seen from miles around, even as far as Exmouth. Within 2 years, the barn had morphed into an application for a farm shop, cafe, parking, offices. This was withdrawn. All mention of the need for storage had clearly disappeared. The local population had now become aware and covertly monitored the site without any entry or damage. Months passed and it wasn't visited. The next development involved an application for a community hub with 150 houses. A community hub with 150 houses. 390 people objected. It was withdrawn. And here we are again, at public expense, dealing with the next episode, greenwashed to 85 houses. With this history, where there has been probable abuse of the planning process, public patience exhausted, and the credibility of this application put in question, I strongly urge the planning committee to dismiss it forthwith. And, if possible, and for the sake of my grandchildren, to prevent its reappearance in yet another form. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please remain seated, sir. Please remain seated. Sorry. Can you just switch your microphone off, please? Absolutely. Thank you. Right. Members of the committee, do you have questions for Mr. Hahn? Right. I see no questions. In that case, now, sir, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Pass over to the director. Oh no, so we have sorry director, we have councillors speaking under standing order 44. I have first of all Councillor Snow. Sorry, Martin, I didn't want to deprive you of your moment in front of the microphone. Councillor Snow, as you are aware, you do not have a time limit to your presentation, but I do urge brevity and being concise. Thank you.
I suspect I'll take about as much time as Mr. Hallam for his very, very good speech. Ruth Williams will also be speaking, and I'll try not to duplicate anything which she's likely to say. Therefore, I will restrict my comments to transport issues and biodiversity. Under transport, firstly, the proposed development of the site is reached from Exeter via a single-track stone bridge, a steep hill, a narrow road, blind curve, and there are currently no pavements. The road is very shaded, making it slippery from frosts and fallen leaves in the winter. It does not appear feasible, although it is shown there, that a footpath could be put in place, and the lower part of Stoke Hill near the bridge is very badly affected by runoff from surrounding fields in the winter. The topography of the area makes car use the most likely method of transport used. It is an area which has seen a number of accidents, and only last Christmas a car crashed into the Mincing Lake Brook and recovery was very difficult. The transport assessment given does not include vehicle movements, as has been said, for visitors in and out of the so-called community hub. So that will be inaccurate. Any vehicles leaving development for the city centre will be channelled down Stoke Hill, past Stoke Hill Junior School and Stoke Hill Primary and Nursery Schools to the very overcrowded 5-way roundabout with Old Tiverton Road, Rosebarn Lane, Mount Pleasant and Prince Charles Road. Vehicles not taking this route will travel along Collins Road and Mincing Lake Road, both of which are used to get children to school from the Stoke Hill and Sylvania estates, and are themselves often congested with parking. Mention has been made of a potential bus service. Well, I'm sorry, but the width of the stone bridge accessing Stoke Hill and the sheer economics makes this extremely unlikely. So there's no real sustainable travel plan there. Moving on to biodiversity of the site, this developer is looking to build on a greenfield site adjacent to 2 wildlife sites and within Exeter's northern wooded hills and Meadows Habitat Reservoir. This is against the proposed Exeter plan. It is on a hillside and it will be visible from large areas of the Sylvania estate and the Mincing Lake Valley Park. That will be in breach of Core Strategy Objective CP16. The danger to veteran trees and their root systems has clearly been identified. Overall, there's significant net biodiversity loss on the site, where in actuality, the developer is required to demonstrate that a net gain can be achieved. This has not been done. So the area is very rich in its biodiversity. Personally, I'm a member of the Bat Conservation Trust, and over the last 2 weeks have personally identified, with use of my bat detector, use of prop, pipistrelle and possibly soprano pipistrelle bats flying in the vicinity of the entrance to the proposed development. Lighting, the destruction of hedgerows and trees, etc., will affect the bat's abilities to hunt, navigate, and set up roosts. It should be noted that these animals are protected by law. All in all, therefore, on behalf of the many objections to this scheme, I would urge the committee to refuse the application, which would tear a hole in one of Exeter's green lungs, that is the treescape surrounding Mincing Lake Valley Park and our northern hills. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Stern. Just switch off your microphone for a moment, please. Thank you. Do any members have questions for Councillor Snow? In that case, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Chair.
Now call on Councillor Williams, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to Christopher Cummings for his very detailed report and reasons why committee he recommends refusal. I'd also like to thank both Mr. Hallam for his very succinct comment and also Councillor Snow. So you'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to speak for as long as I did last time. I think the main point for me is that this is a sensitive setting and significant harm to the landscape setting would occur if this went ahead. So as you can see, we've already in my ward had 2 applications where the committee refused them and they were overturned on appeal. That's Celia Crescent one and the Pendragon Road. And this is even more sensitive than those because it's slightly higher up. So what I'm going to do is just to draw you to attention of the refusal recommendations from Christopher, because I think it's all there for you. I'll read them out. Number 1, the proposed development would harm the character and local distinctiveness of the hills to the north of the city and the landscape setting of the city. It would create a piecemeal urban development on a greenfield site in the designated landscape setting area that would be visible from adjoining public spaces and public and private routes and spaces within the wider urban areas. It would appear incongruous and not in keeping with the rural character of the hillside and Mincing Lake Valley Park. And then Chris provides reasons for refusal contrary to various policies, all listed there for you. Number 2, the proposed development would see a reliance on private motor vehicles due to the location of the site on the edge of the city, limited public transport, provision of community hub, and steep topography of the surrounding area, with an associated unacceptable increase to highway safety. And then it lists the various policies. Number 3, the proposal would create significant harm to the biodiversity through habitat loss, impact on priority bat species, which Councillor Snow's already mentioned, country wildlife sites and important wildlife corridors, and as a result of habitat loss and or degradation from lighting, habitat removal and recreational pressure. The 4th point is the proposal would result in significant harm to a veteran oak tree location. And the 5th is the absence of Section 106 legal agreements, and where they are all listed for you, and that's all on page 56. So I think it's all there. Chris is already recommending refusal. I fully support that, and I urge you to refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there any questions from members to Councillor Williams on her comments? No, I don't see any. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution, Councillor. Over to you, Director.
Very, very quick summing up. I think it's all been set out there for you, as you've heard. So this proposal is contrary to the local plan and conflicts with several policies, including but not limited to that one about landscape setting, where your officers feel there will be significant harm. As like the previous application, the tilted balance does not apply here. Notwithstanding that, officers cannot see that the benefits of this development would sufficiently outweigh that harm for the reasons that have been set out for you in the report.
Thank you, Director. Inviting comments from the committee. Start off with you, Councillor Ketchin.
There seem to be a lot of people talking in favour of this, and I think it says a lot that the developer hasn't bothered to turn up to make their case tonight either. And I'm also very pleased to hear that the Exeter local plan is getting mentioned in this case. I think it is important to hear about that, because it will carry more and more weight as it develops further. I'm not going to speak anything more on that, but I will be voting against.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Patrick.
Thank you, Chair. There's much not to like about this application. I'm not going to go right through all of it. We've heard a lot. The access, the reliance on private vehicles, the concerns that those with various different difficulties in walking are going to have an extremely tough time living there or accessing their community centre that lots of people in the community won't be able to use if they don't have a private vehicle. Doesn't really hold much weight. So yeah, I'd be minded to refuse this application.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm really concerned about the lack of consideration that's been given to those who have different abilities to mobilise, those who are elderly, those who are infirm, those like myself who have difficulties with mobility. I don't see how anything advertising to be a community hub can be this inaccessible to many people. And I think for that reason alone, that's enough for me to reject this. But, you know, once you start throwing in the bats, the oak tree, the skyline, the landscape, it's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. It's just not accessible and therefore, you know, not approvable.
Thank you, Councillor. Anybody else wish to speak? Councillor Paul.
Yeah, I just, again, to sort of echo what the other councillors have said, I think that there is a very compelling recommendation for refusal here. I've bicycled up Stoke Hill myself, and in fact I had to dismount to cross the road at that point, and it was very, very difficult to sort of get between the oncoming cars, which were coming very fast, and I don't think it's an accessible site whatsoever. I do think, again, that the landscape of the Northern Hills is very important to Exeter's special character as a city, and I think it's very important that we protect those Northern Hills, and the landscape and visual impact does seem to be quite impacted by this application.
Thank you, councillor. Anybody else wishing to speak? No, I'm just going to say myself that we are not in a Clarkson's Farm scenario of conducting some vendetta against somebody's wish to create a viable business. And we shouldn't be considering the actual existence of the barn and things like that. That's a matter for enforcement rather than us. What we need to do instead is to consider the application before us and the recommendation by the officer. I think I've heard from everybody now, and so I wish to propose that we go to a vote. The vote being to accept the officer's recommendation to refuse. Okay, so I'm asking for a seconder for that. I think Councillor Ketchin. I'm now asking for a clear indication of those in favour of a vote to refuse the application.
It's unanimous, Chair.
Thank you. I'm seeing all hands, and therefore don't need to ask for those against or abstains. The motion is carried. That is that the application is refused. Thank you. Right, do you want another 5-minute break in view of the temperature? Okay, thanks. Exactly that, please. 5 minutes only. Thank you.
Happy that the officers, you can normally go around and say whatever
I'm moving on. If I had a gavel, I would bang it, but instead I shall just speak to you. We're moving on to item number 7, which is the planning application 24/0009/FUL. This is the planning application for Tesco's stores to build a McDonald's. Right, the relevant officer, who's not Catherine.
Thank you, Chair. So this final application for you to decide this evening is for a McDonald's drive-through restaurant on part of the Tesco store, Russell Way. The case officer, Catherine Miller-Macy, is on leave this evening, so I am presenting on her behalf. This slide shows the site location plan. It shows the site primarily comprises the redundant overflow car park at the Tesco store. This is the aerial view showing that car park, and as can be seen, it is surrounded by vegetated areas comprising trees and overgrown shrubs. This slide just summarizes the proposed development. Things to pick out here is it will include 42 car parking spaces and 12 cycle spaces. And this is the proposed site layout showing the proposed drive-through restaurant to the left of this slide. Access is proposed in the southwest corner, utilizing one of the existing access points into the overflow car park, whilst another access in the middle will be closed off and infilled with vegetation. Some car parking provision will be provided to the south of the restaurant, with the drive-through access skirting the northern boundary. The vegetation on the site will be improved through better management. While some existing trees will need to be removed, there will be replacement tree planting and biodiversity enhancements provided. The existing footpath to the north opposite the existing petrol filling station will be widened to improve pedestrian access, to require the existing bus stop shelter to be slightly relocated as shown on the plan. Part of the proposal includes some additional car parking outlined in light green for the main Tesco store to the south, and a slight rearrangement of the Tesco car park. This slide shows the proposed elevations of the building. We've built from grey brick, timber boarding, and a green walling system for part of the building as well. There were 26 objections to this application, with the main issues listed on this slide. But the principle of this proposal is acceptable. It will be on an existing retail park, and saved local plan policy S5 permits hot food takeaways within purpose-built retail developments. And a sequential test has been undertaken as required by the National Planning Policy framework, as this is an out-of-centre site, but no other more sequentially preferable sites have been identified for this proposal. Therefore, the principle of the application is acceptable. In terms of consultees, there have been no objections, subject to conditions being added. So this includes the local highway authority in terms of the additional traffic that the proposal will generate in terms of impact on the local highway network. And whilst the council's own design officer did have concerns with the proposal and did object originally,
they have now withdrawn their objection following some improvements that have been made in light of officer feedback. So the initial concerns have been addressed. So, for example, the green living wall is proposed in light of officer advice to soften the appearance of the building. Fewer trees will be removed than originally proposed. There will be significant biodiversity net gains, and it's considered that the design of the building will not be out of keeping with the character of the surrounding area. So looking at the character of the area, again, just highlighting the location and the surrounding uses, which include obviously a very large car park for the main Tesco store, petrol filling station, existing restaurants, and the retail park to the northwest. And these are just some photos of the surrounding area. That's the petrol filling station and the main Tesco store and its car park. The existing takeaway KFC restaurant and the retail park comprising various retail uses. This photo shows a view towards the site. This view shows the view of the site in the summer, and as can be seen, it isn't visible due to the surrounding vegetation and trees. And likewise in winter, the site is still heavily screened. This plan shows pedestrian access on the site. So the existing zebra crossing on the existing access road into the Tesco store will be retained, with an additional zebra crossing provided within the site to provide safe access from the direction of the Tesco store. The green lines indicate where pedestrians will walk within the site. It includes some footways, although the parking area to the south don't have separate footways, although on balance officers consider that this would be satisfactory. This slide just highlights the biodiversity enhancement that would be achieved. So while 6 trees would be removed, there'd be 6 trees would be removed. There'd be 16 new trees, whilst 15 trees would be retained, and various new vegetation will be planted, as well as bat boxes and bird boxes, bee and insect hotels, etc. In light of some concerns raised by residents, such as concerns that the proposal might lead to an increase in antisocial behaviour, or concerns over noise, as the facility is proposed to operate 24 hours, concerns over litter of such a use or odour, conditions have been added. So if you look at your report, you'll see those conditions. And we have taken advice from the council's environmental health officers accordingly. And there have been no objections subject to those conditions being added. So it's quite normal for these sorts of concerns to be raised for these sorts of proposals, but they aren't usually sufficient enough to lead to a refusal. So in terms of the officer's planning balance, the benefits are that it will be an appropriate use of a brownfield site, representing an efficient use of land. It would create economic benefits through employment during the construction phase, and also will provide 62 full-time equivalent jobs when it is operating. It will generate SIL, as mentioned, there will be biodiversity and landscape enhancements. Whilst the 10% biodiversity net gain doesn't apply statutorily to this application because it was submitted before statutory biodiversity net gain was introduced, it will still lead to a significant biodiversity enhancement. As I said, there are some adverse impacts, but these can all be mitigated through conditions. So the recommendation by your officers is that the scheme is acceptable in principle and it accords with the development plan, and take into account the presumption in favour of sustainable development in the MPPF. There are no reasons to refuse this application and it should be granted subject to conditions. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, members. So we'll start off with Councillor Mitchell and Councillor Jobson.
Just a couple of questions to Matt. As you know, this is looking like it's going to become a fast food hub there because we've already got the other three just around the corner. And I'm just wondering that the siting of this particular building on that site, is it sited to be furthest away from the housing that's just across the road? Is it equidistant between the other development at the other junction from housing across the road? Because I would have thought we would want to ensure that there's the widest possible gap between the site of the building and residential housing. So if you could just assure me on that one. And secondly, there's no mention and nothing in the pictures. What about associated advertising, logo and lighting that's normally associated with McDonald's? Will that be subject to a separate application, or is that included on here? Because, as you say, it's hidden around a corner at the moment. They'll need some road signage, etc., to highlight this. And I'd be very concerned if that was illuminated, particularly adjacent to residential properties. That's my two questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Mitchell. So the site is fairly constrained, it's quite narrow, so I don't think there was much choice in terms of where they could put the building. But just looking at the aerial plan, it appears that the building will be sited to the north, which arguably is slightly further away from the houses to the east than if it was sited to the south, but it's marginal. But the important thing to point out is that there's quite a dense piece of vegetation that will screen the development, mitigate it visually and in terms of noise, etc. And yes, the plans do include imagery of proposed signage for the proposal and lighting, but they will need to be subject to a separate advertisement consent process. Okay.
Councillor Jobs.
Thank you. A number of questions, if I may, to various people. As you know, it's part of the St Lloyd's ward, and residents have taken a very mixed view about it. But the questions are these. It is right, isn't it, that if they wanted to move to 24-hour licensing, that would have to go to a licensing committee. It's not something that can be dealt with by condition of this committee. That's the first one. We're somewhat surprised that there's no comment from local Devon County Council highways. Russell Way is a busy road anyway. And if you look at image on page 12 of the presentation, you get a picture. It's not page 12, is it? It is. Yeah, that one. As people come out of the petrol station now and go round that roundabout, down towards the traffic lights, they can see those traffic lights from fairly close to that roundabout. And the residents know that if those lights, they watch them change green or they're on green, that they speed down towards that without any thought of the fact that there may be pedestrians or cyclists coming across Lewis Crescent and Russell Way at that point there. Now, at night time or in winter time, that could well be more dangerous than it currently is with just the existing fast food restaurants. So It was slightly surprised that there's been no recommendations for conditions about speeding in that vicinity between the roundabout and the traffic lights. And the second thing is, of course, there is a risk as you get at, as you've had at Stone Lane, where there's a drive-through, of traffic backing up at that roundabout, either to get in to the Tesco supermarket or into the drive-through, because they'll be using the same bit of track, or actually coming down from the other traffic lights and on both sides of the road. And it's sort of, they do worry that there is going to be more significant traffic congestion at that site, and whether anything can be done by way of condition to prevent that. So that was the second issue. The third is environmental health, lighting, external lighting of the building. There have been complaints about the lighting at Taco Bell's, which is on site, which in the winter is very visible from some of the residents just off Digby Drive and Eatonhouse Close. I say that their back bedrooms get those lights going in. So is there an assurance, can there be a condition that there will be no lighting that is visible on the public, to the public who live? It's fairly close. You've got Lewis Crescent, Cooper Meadows, Eatonhurst, all those roads there. They live very close to that. For some of them, it would be their front bedroom windows, but for a lot of them, it's their back windows, which is where the children sleep. So that's external lighting. Odour is the other issue. I've seen the condition proposed. Is there any more that can be done on that condition? We know that at least twice a year, the Kentucky Fried Chicken has to be reminded to change their odour filters. Is there a system? I don't know, but an expert might be able to tell me whether there is an odour system that does not require filters or filters to be changed so regularly. Is it possible to improve that condition? Is it absolutely necessary that this has to become a drive-through? I think a lot of residents would feel it a lot better if it was just McDonald's without the drive-through, and that would, of course, then alleviate all the traffic concerns as well. And I think there was one more. Oh yes, CCTV. I can see that there's a condition proposed. Is that going to be on the site itself, at entrances to the site? Is there going to be any CCTV that will look down Russell Way? Maybe even a speed camera down there? But any other conditions that can be put in that will protect the site and perhaps deter a level of antisocial behaviour. I think there are those who feel that the site may be a little better because at the moment quite a lot of boy racers, or it might be girl racers I suppose, but on motorbikes go into that car park and do wheelies in the early hours of the morning. But those are the questions.
You switch them up. So my understanding from the report, because I've not checked myself, but I know Catherine did, was that to operate 24 hours per day, it would need to have a separate license from the licensing committee. Devon County Council Highways were consulted and did comment on the application. We have Ben Sunderland here this evening, so I'll allow him to comment on your queries, because he'll be better qualified than myself. In terms of the issues over lighting and odour and CCTV, so these are issues that detailed reports were submitted with the application, and we consulted the experts within the council and our environmental health team, and so no concerns were raised that would require different conditions to be worded. So the conditions have been worded and are considered acceptable by our experts. I cannot confirm where the CCTV will be located, but as it is controlled by condition, we should have control over that matter via the conditions process. I'll allow Ben to comment on the access issues while I consider further your queries.
Thank you for your questions. Just quickly with the two questions that you asked relating to, firstly, the Russell Way and the speed down to the A379, it's currently subject to a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit along there. I don't think it'd be possible under policy to be able to reduce that speed limit any further, but if there is a consistent issue with speeding along there, that would be a matter to be brought up with the police to look into that. So I'm not sure there's anything we can do at that point with regards to that. In terms of the traffic building up back onto Russell Way, it should be noted that the extent of the highway is onto Russell Way. So you'd have all of the queuing within the McDonald's application site, and then you've got queuing which goes within the Tesco car park back to the roundabout. To there, so there's a lot of queuing which can be dealt with in sight away from the highway, but it also needs to be remembered anyone coming into Tesco as well wouldn't necessarily just have to turn left. There is another option to be able to use the Tesco car park by going straight across the roundabout to access it. So in my opinion, looking at it, it's unlikely that there's going to be a severe impact building back towards the highway from this application.
Might I just ask a supplementary? Thank you. So on the first point, at a 30 mile per hour, if people stuck to that, would be wonderful. But there is a lot of speeding there. We know there's been accidents and near misses at Lewis Crescent and that. It just seems that, oh, the police haven't done anything, nothing's to be done. It's not that we want the speed limit reduced, but something, a flashing sign or say 30 miles per hour or anything that reminds people of their obligations would be helpful.
Yes, I can understand where you're coming from with that. That may be something that can be looked at, but I'm not sure it's something that, because it would only be a temporary, it's not there all the time having a 30-mile-an-hour flashing sign. It would be a temporary one, so that's something that's looked at under a separate process than my remit through the planning application.
Also, I would like to say that obviously that's not really in our remit as a planning committee in order to be able to impose conditions on DCC relating to traffic management or even the police. So I understand your concern.
The applicant could make a contribution.
So you're going to suggest that as an additional Do I have any more questions to the officers, please? Councillor Banyard.
Thank you. So on page 135, the report we were given, it says for this site, it says that it is acknowledged that this site is allocated for residential development in the draft local plan. And is there a good reason why we're considering a commercial development on this site and ignoring the draft local plan? That was my question.
Yeah, so the case officer has picked up that in the latest version of the Exeter plan, it was proposed for residential development. First of all, the weight that you can give to the Exeter plan at the stage it's reached is very limited. I'd say almost 1%. That would change when it's submitted for examination and will change as it goes through the examination process. At the moment, we can only give a very limited weight. I would also say that I think officers consider that this site is equally acceptable for commercial use, given that it is on effectively a retail park surrounded by retail uses.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, please? No. You want to? No, the director doesn't have any comments for us. Looking at the list of speakers, we've got nobody speaking for it. We've got nobody speaking against it. We have no councillor speaking under Standing Order 44. I therefore ask us to move into the debate. If anybody wishes to contribute, I call Councillor Jobson first, then Councillor Hughes, then Councillor Patrick.
Thank you. This is an interesting application because I think I've probably had as many emails saying, "Hi, wow, the one thing we haven't got in the area is McDonald's, yippee," to those saying, "Why the heck do we need another fast food outlet?" So one has to look at it on absolutely purely planning grounds. And there are, it is a shame that they have gone through for a drive-through, because I think had they not gone for a drive-through, that people would have, knowing that there's a lot of traffic, those Tesco's would assume that they'd be going mainly for their shopping and then get a burger on the way home or go and sit in the restaurant or whatever. And so that is a pity, because the drive-through element does have problems. I listened to what Ben Sunderland has had to say, but the residents who live there, particularly those on Lewis Crescent, say they take their lives into their hands every time they cross Russell Way these days. I think there was a near miss with the cyclist, because the cycle route crosses that at one point recently. And there is a problem of traffic speeding down Russell Way. So the first thing I would suggest is that maybe the applicant could be asked to provide a contribution to some sort of warning signage beyond that roundabout, warning people that it is a 30-mile-per-hour speed limit. You know, it doesn't need to be expensive gizmo with a flashing light like you get the flashing 20-mile-per-hour ones or whatever. That would show that they were cognizant that people walking or cycling to their restaurant would like to be able to cross the road safely at the Lewis Crescent junction. I think the other issues are the issue of odour. It is probably now down to twice a year. It was considerably more than that, but the Kentucky Fried Chicken, environmental health are always being contacted, or regularly being contacted, being asked to remind. I'd have to go out to remind them to deal with the filters. It may be that there is a different filtration system, but I would ask that when looking at these objections, that the type of filtration system is asked for and how often they plan on changing the filters. Because if you live in a house that backs onto it and all you get is a combination of Kentucky Fried Chicken, Taco Bells and burgers, you probably go off your meal that evening, I should imagine. And the other thing is so that's the odour, is the lighting. I understand external lighting may well form a separate advertising thing, but it would be good if before any arrangements were seen, particularly in the winter, that the lighting at Taco Bell's could be looked at. Presumably they have permission to put that, and that is very intrusive lighting. There haven't been any complaints, to my knowledge, from the Kentucky Fried Chicken establishment, which has got. So whatever they do, if it's approved tonight, then McDonald's could perhaps do the same. And when it comes to, I note the comments of the urban design and landscape officer, and of course they said about the drive-through being a problem as well. I think the other thing is the CCTV that's mentioned in the conditions. Can't find it, but you know where it is. And that the CCTV shouldn't just be cameras looking at the McDonald's restaurant, but should certainly cover the wider Tesco car park, where Tesco's perhaps don't currently reach, and I'm assuming that they have CCTV themselves, and that they certainly cover the area from the roadway that goes from the roundabout to turn left. But if they turn left again into McDonald's restaurant, again, I'm anticipating that the petrol station probably has some CCTV coverage there, but that if everyone could sort of do some joined up thinking and make sure that when whatever CCTV is in place, that all those areas are covered, then I think some of the residents' fears about antisocial behaviour will be met. I know that subjects like litter Well, the Digby Residents Association has a very active litter picking group, and I no doubt will be contacting McDonald's to see if they can help with that. And it would, I don't know whether this McDonald's would plan on doing a litter pick around the area. I know some McDonald's do, and I would have thought that if they could do that virtually the same bit from the Lewis Crescent zebra crossing up and any footpaths through to the site and round the roadway in, if they could make sure that that was kept clean and tidy, Digby residents would be happier than some of them are at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, it's just a brief one from me. On the planning that has been, the planning application that's been presented, I can't oppose the recommendation that's being given by officers. So I'm happy to support you in that. But I do just want to take this opportunity to urge everybody involved, whoever in the council, in the city council that can do this, to really look at the antisocial behaviour issue, because that is my one concern about this planning application. And I don't want to repeat what Councillor Jobson has said, but I would like to just add my voice to support the comment that she did make about antisocial behaviour and the racing of motorbikes, the racing of cars, the handbrake turns, all of that stuff, and that kind of hanging out behaviour that tends to happen in these sorts of developments. So I guess I would just say, could we do all we can to urge McDonald's to bear that in mind when they're looking at their security staffing and their CCTV. But yes, on a planning basis, I can't argue with you, but I would urge you, please, to, if there's anything you could do to make that a condition of the approval, I would appreciate it. And I'm sure Councillor Jobson would as well.
Thank you, Councillor Hughes. Councillor Patrick first.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, so I will be supporting this application. I do welcome I'm not a massive fan of McDonald's, but myself, but I do welcome the employment opportunities, especially for the sort of local residents of the housing development around there. The site at the moment is a bit of a state, actually, right now, and I imagine, I might be wrong, I haven't actually been there and wandered around at night on my own, but I'd imagine there probably is quite a bit of antisocial behaviour going on in that area. It's quite a convenient space for people to sort of hang out and do things that they wouldn't necessarily be able to do with a McDonald's development there. So I'm hoping that the antisocial behaviour around that area might actually be potentially even be reduced. In terms of the traffic, I think that, don't forget, it is a drive-through, but there's nothing stopping people from actually parking at Tesco's and walking over the road and getting the McDonald's. So it is possible, I would imagine, that most of the journeys there would be people already going to Tesco's or Curry's or Pets at Home or whatever. It's not necessarily going to create tons of extra traffic, just another opportunity for people that are shopping there to get takeaway. So yeah, for those reasons, I'll be supporting this.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Ketchin.
Just to back up what Councillor Jobson said, I understand there's legislation to require a restaurant like this to, within 100 metres, be required to do litter picking. I'm not familiar with the legislation, but I don't know if it's a condition on this site as such. I didn't read the conditions, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. I will ask that question of officers then. Is it possible or feasible for us as a committee to ask for a litter pick, or is that completely outside our remit?
A condition has been added addressing litter. So I don't have the knowledge as to how far it goes beyond the site. But there's the answer then. I did read the committee report. There's a lot to remember in it. And yeah, in terms of other issues that we raised, I think members just need to be mindful of the tests that apply to conditions and the tests that means that conditions must relate to the development proposed. And I think a lot of what I've heard relate to problems that are existing already in this area that might not necessarily relate to this particular proposal. So whilst we'll do what we can with the conditions, we just have to be mindful of that test, and members need to be mindful of that test as well.
Thank you. I will also remind members that there are 30 conditions there already, and they do cover most of the issues that have been raised. I'll ask, has anybody else got any contribution? Councillor Pole?
I was just going to really make the comment that that there is a bus service that serves this proposed new restaurant. The iBus goes from Whipton, where we do already have a lot of takeaways, but it also goes from Countess Weir and the High Street, and that is 7 minutes walk from Digby and Soughton Station, and that, as far as I understand it, the site is quite well served as a cycle route. So I just would say that seems like a positive, and just as a comment, really.
Thank you, Councillor Paul. I'm asking for any other contributions to the debate. Councillor Hussain, lovely to hear from you.
Thank you, Chair. I live by the Tesco, so I know this area environment, I can say. The Tesco was open 24 hours previously. Right now it's closed. The reason was there's a lot of shoplifting. People go and get all the stuff from there. That's why they stop, 24-hour service. So I don't know, Tesco is quite big. They can't run it because of there's a lot of issue going on. And I can see McDonald's is like, this is small compared to Tesco on that area. So do you think it's a big problem in this area? Plus I know, because I live down there. So all I can say, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Okay, I believe we've come to the end of our contributions. Am I correct? In that case, I'm going to move to propose the motion. The motion is that this committee accepts the recommendation of the officer, and that is to grant permission. Again, I'm asking for a clear indication of hand. Those in favour? Also, and yes, my second is for Councillor Patrick. They're asking for a clear indication of those in favour to grant permission.
That is unanimous, Chair.
So unanimous decision, therefore do not need to ask for an against or abstentions. That motion is carried. So we shall now move on to the next item on our agenda. If I can find the agenda now after all, under all this. Okay, so we have on agenda item 8 a list of decisions made and withdrawn applications. Those form pages 173 to 202. I ask if any members have contributions relating to that list.
Get the heading on each of these saying delegated briefing. And when I look at the ones on my ward, they've not been to delegated briefing. So I'm just wondering what that heading's there. I can understand if they have been to delegated briefing, there's a date, but when they haven't been to delegated briefing, I don't know why there's a date next to that particular section. And it's never on a date the delegated briefing meets anyway, so it's confusing.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Mitchell, for raising that again. And I did ask for it to be investigated last time. Clearly that hasn't worked. So I'll write it down and pursue it again tomorrow.
Are there any questions relating to the list of decisions made and withdrawn applications? I don't see that, so therefore we will be noting that report. We now come to agenda item 9, which is the appeals report. Does anybody have any contributions to make regarding the appeals? Councillor Mitchell.
I almost got very excited until I got to the end, because everyone was dismissed until we got to the end of this particular paper, which makes a nice change. But I'd just like to draw members to attention, particularly those members on the committee at the time, and to Councillor Violet for his vocal opinions on the matter of the Newbury car breakers yard, that we actually where the members took a decision opposite to the highway authority at the time, at that time, and stuck to their guns on the particular, and the inspector did support the views of councillors that the highway issue was important, that the pathway should be provided for pedestrians in those beautiful Devon lanes. So,
thank you, Councillor. Any more comments relating to the appeals report? In that case, I ask this committee to accept the report, and it goes into record. Thank you very much. We have a list for our next meeting. That is Monday, the 2nd of September. Thank you all very much for your attendance this evening, for your perseverance through what has been quite a warm evening. And I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you. And good night.
Thank you.